All right, again, just for folks that are just starting to join in, we'll get ready to get started in about a minute. Like I said earlier, there are over 500 people registered for today's event, so we just want to give everyone a chance to join us in the room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so it's about 1:02. I think we should go ahead and get started. Hello, good afternoon, welcome everyone. This is our final webinar in our Power of Policies and Procedures series. Today's topic is keeping policies and procedures relevant and responsive. My name is Daniela Labate-Cavelli. I'm from NIAPRS, and we are a MCTAC partner. I'm joined today by three of my favorite people, so I'm just going to go ahead and give them a chance to introduce themselves. So John, did you want to go ahead and say hi?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to join you. I'm my name is John Coppola. I'm the Executive Director for the New York Association of Alcoholism and Substance Abuse Providers. Happy to be on this team and really look forward to our conversation today.
Great, thanks. Marlo.
Hi, everyone. Happy almost Friday. I'm Marlo Passion. I am the Director of Training at the Center for Rehabilitation and Recovery at the Coalition for Behavioral Health. And I'm very happy to be here with all of you. Thanks for joining us.
I guess it's my turn. Hi, I'm Eve Addis, and I am a consultant for with NIAPRS for the last, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy that all of you have found this topic interesting. So welcome.
Great, thank you, everyone. So Tara, if we could just move to the next slide. We have just a few housekeeping things to get through. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the slides and the recording from today's webinar, as well as all the other ones in the series, will be hosted on the MCTAC or CTAC website. We are going to do our best to answer all of your questions today, but as always, if we do not get to answer any of your questions, we do take a really deep dive into the chat box afterwards, and we take note of all of the things that people are saying and asking questions about, and we'll incorporate those into future trainings. We're also going to be incorporating all of your comments from today and the other webinars into some tip sheets for you, so be on the lookout for that. And finally, we want this to be, you know, a really exciting webinar where everybody can get to say something, even though there are so many of you here. We do want to use the chat box, and we have some poll questions today, so we want you to be involved in the conversation with us. So please, we encourage you to use the chat box and type in your questions to all panelists so that we can take a look at them as they come in. And we'll be taking some breaks in between the presentation today to answer some questions, and we've also set aside some time at the end for more Q&A. All right, so next slide is just our partner slide, and you can see all of our lovely logos. And the next slide is just a summary of all of the webinars that are in the series, the Policies and Procedures series. So we encourage you to, if you've missed a recording or if you've missed one of the webinars, all of those recordings and the PowerPoints will be available at the ctacny.org website. So we encourage you to look for those. Okay, so I think we're going to start off with a little quick review and really just talk a little bit about why policies and procedures are important. So they really serve several purposes, right? There are probably more than the 5 main points that you see on the screen, but we thought we'd sort of highlight just a couple of them here. You know, they set expectations and they keep people accountable. They also ensure compliance with regulations, and they give various stakeholders direction. And they really help defend against employee claims. But another main point about why policies and procedures are important is that we've really tried to, you know, stress this throughout the series, the last few webinars, is that they really do or should empower the workforce to make sound decisions, and not just the workforce, but the board and anyone else, any stakeholder that's involved in a policy or procedure. So we really wanted to stress that and sort of keep that thread going through. You know, policies are not about being punitive, they're about giving direction. Procedures are about giving direction and making sure that the staff is, or any stakeholder there really, is equipped to handle any situation that they may be presented with. So with that, I'm going to just turn it over to John because I know he has a little bit more to say about this. If we could go to the next slide.
So, I think it's really important for us to think about, why policies and procedures and how do we, they're really important, and how do we sort of communicate them to our staff, and what do they mean? What's the culture that exists around this? So it's not just about compliance. It's not just to sort of somehow restate regulations from OASIS or OMH or some funding source and what their expectations are. It's not just about, following the rules. And also, it's not just about avoiding, bad situations. We got to put a policy in place to make sure this doesn't happen or that doesn't happen. So if you think about the idea of how can we be responsive to all of our stakeholders, how can we be positive and put a positive message out there? So to really use policies and procedures as a catalyst for the professional growth of our employees. When we look at the policies and procedures manual, after reading it, does a new employee feel they're going to be safe? They feel that they're going to have a clear sense of direction and communication within the organization. So just that whole sense of being able to feel like they're in a good place and they're going to develop in this job. Also, does the policy and procedures send a good vibe about the community and the commitment of the organization? When you look at it, is it about the organization as a part of a community that's growing and feeling responsive to the needs of people in the community, and which is one of empowerment, right? Not just, again, as Daniela said, it's sort of a punitive thing. Is it bringing out the best in people, focused on mission, principles, and especially now as we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, does the policy communicate how we value? The reason why we're doing these policies and procedures is because we value people, we value our employees, and we value everybody. And then finally, just that the policies and procedures can be a way of really laying out a blueprint almost for achievement of organizational goals, for the programs, for all the different programs, and also the culture in the organization, whether it's the workforce, administration, frontline staff. Does it promote sort of a sense of the value of everybody who is involved in the whole scenario, the staff, clients, community, et cetera? So it's a real opportunity to put a very positive face on the organization.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that, John, and I think you'll agree that you have to do what you're saying, to really convey that. You have to be very attentive to language. And when you're writing your policies and procedures, pay attention to the language and the words that you're using, because that is the vehicle for conveying what John is talking about.
Absolutely. Is it inclusive? Is it sort of about valuing? Is it positive? Is it conjuring up positive feedback, from folks? Absolutely.
All right, thank you very much. So I think we're going to go into a poll now. Tara, if you could pull up the next slide. So we just wanted to kind of gauge where folks were at on the line with us in regards to today's topic and updating policies and procedures regularly. So there, if your organization isn't updating policies and procedures regularly, what might be the obstacle? So just real quick, if you could just quickly answer the poll. The answers we are thinking about are, we don't have this issue. We make updates regularly. We don't have enough staff trained to do this well. It's low on our list of priorities. We're unsure of how often they should be updated. We're unsure of how to disseminate updated policies and procedures, or if there's something that's not on the list, we would encourage you to use the chat box to type that in so we can see what we may have missed. All right, so Tara, it looks like, if you could help me sort of see where we're at here. It looks
absolutely.
like most, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So about 22% of respondents chose A, 17% chose B, 4% chose C, 5% chose D, no one chose E, and then we received a couple of responses in the chat. One person said that they try, but the specific program changes constantly, as in the funder changes.
Okay.
Another person chatted in, policy and procedure updates are sometimes delayed due to the volume of priorities for admin staff. And one other person chatted that it's the culmination of most of them.
All right, great, thank you. So we have a pretty good split here, and it sounds like the folks that use the chat box, we're gonna be addressing some of those questions or comments that you've made in today's webinar anyway. So that was great. All right, so let's move into shifting to talking a little bit about training. And we're going to do that by, I'm going to send this over to Eve, I think now, right? Eve, you may be
I'm
muted.
sorry.
There we go.
Okay.
You're
said
good.
I'd like to, am I unmuted?
Yes, we could hear you.
Okay, very good. All right. So what I wanted to say was I'd like to think, as we delve into this issue, to think of a metaphor. So imagine you've just gone out and purchased a device, a new device, right? And you bring it home and you open up the package and there is a manual on how to use the device. And so you use that manual to sort of learn how to, which buttons to press, how to get to all the bells and whistles that the device can provide. And you keep going back to that as you start getting familiar with using the device until, you pretty much know what to do. And so that's kind of what a policy and procedure provides you with. It helps you to kind of learn and have a reference for how to sort of operate within your organization. The difference, however, and there is a difference, is that a device remains static. In other words, it does what it does, you learn what it does, and then that's it. And so if you want to buy the next model, you have to go out and spend some more money, and then you'll get a new manual. But an organization is much more sort of organic, and it changes. And so we have to think about that manual in a different way. In other words, we're not going to go out and buy a new manual. We're just going to have to kind of be aware of how the organizational changes. And somebody talked about, different funders, a changing organization, that you have to kind of keep going back and making sure that your manual reflects the components or the new sort of bells and whistles, if you will, of your organizations. So unless you kind of think of it that way, and you think about policies and procedures as this organic thing that needs to be looked at and addressed and modified as the organization grows, changes, and as new people come into the organization, and as the structure of the organization sometimes changes. And unless you do that, and unless you sort of approach it that way, it's going to be very difficult to make sound decisions. And especially if you're in a leadership position, having sort of policies and procedures that the workforce can use in order to do their jobs allows you to make sound decisions, and it allows the workforce to make sound decisions in their day-to-day work. So, there are the kinds of regulations that we get these sort of blasts from our funders about that something has changed. If you're a Medicaid provider, well, that's pretty much changing all the time. Now we have all these regulations that are sort of constantly adapting to telehealth. And so, how do we keep those policies and procedures kind of connected to these changes and to these regulations? And in effect, unless we are actively, and the word here, the operative word here is active. This is an active process. And it's not, I don't believe that it's any one person's job. I think that basically this is a team, and as organizations change and as policies and procedures are implemented, those policies and procedures, those implementations also inform. Because if you find that if you're implementing a procedure attached to a policy and somehow it doesn't yield, the result that you want, well then, that has to come from the people who are implementing, and they have to say, look, this isn't working. We're trying to meet what this procedure is telling us to do, and it's just not happening. So what do we need to change? So these updates and these changes are not coming from it's not a top-down process. It's something that happens from the bottom up as well. And that's why it's important to periodically kind of debrief around when implementing a procedure, when actually going, to debrief and to sort of talk about what worked, what didn't, and maybe something needs to change. And let's also kind of consider that once you've made these changes, that they are kind of adapted by everyone in the organization. And so there should be a period of time where a new policy and procedure is disseminated and people have a chance to respond to it, to make comments about it, and that may lead to more tweaking. So I know what I'm sounding like is, oh my God, who has the time for this? And I appreciate that. But this is, I don't think this is optional. I really don't. I think this is something that you have to figure out a way to build it in, because if not, what happens is that everybody does things their own way. And once that happens, the organization is open to a lot of liability. And it's going to cost you time and money on the other end. So, avoid, it's kind of like, it's like wearing a seatbelt, if you will. It takes time, it takes thought. You get into the car, you have to put the seatbelt on. Maybe it's a little uncomfortable, but you do it because at the end of the day, you don't want to be injured if you're not wearing the seatbelt. So I don't know if that's a great analogy, but it's a safety one. So I think it works. Next slide, please. So again, this is a little redundant, but build this into your corporate calendar. Sometimes you can have if you have an electronic data management platform, you can actually put in dates where you'll get reminders that a particular policy is due for a review, or it's due, and this is just sort of that, okay, we don't want to forget about this, so we're just going to do a quick review. And then here within that review process, when you write the policy or when the policy is issued the first time, build into it. So actually on the policy document, you can have a section that says to be reviewed on. And so it's built in that this policy is going to be reviewed, even if nobody brings up an issue around it, that somebody will take a look at it, review it, and then put another date down for the following review. You certainly want to review your policy.
I just want to interrupt you for a second, because if folks that are on today's webinar were on the last webinar 2 weeks ago, we had a guest speaker who was talking about how their program updates policies and procedures, and she actually shared some resources with us that I believe they were already posted on the MCTAC website. I'm not 100% sure, but if they weren't, they will be. And so we actually posted 2 templates of policy and procedure templates, and if you'll see the ones that we posted, they actually have the version numbers on them. So that's one other way for people to keep track of which policy and which version of the policy and procedures in their books, in their manuals.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. And I think that those templates are really useful. So do look them up. So you wanna update a policy and procedure when a new program opens, and make sure that all the references to who does what apply, because you may have a very different staffing configuration in a new program, and titles even, that that a policy and procedure that you wrote a year ago completely is devoid of. So you want to make sure that the policy and procedure speaks to all the programs in a way that is relevant to the structure of all the programs. Then, strategically, an organization has its ambition, it has its planning, and you want to make sure that the policies align with any strategic changes in the organizations, and that also may involve staffing and hierarchical changes in terms of leadership. Now, the next bullet references a compliance department. I know not all organizations have a compliance department, but there is usually somebody in the organization that has that kind of subtitle around compliance. So if it's not a department, then it's a person who kind of is the conduit for addressing regulatory changes and bringing, sounding the horn that, hey, this dictate from the state just came in, and we need to set up a policy around this. So, as I mentioned earlier, also, does the policy, does the procedure, and does it work in every program? If it doesn't, then if it doesn't give you the result that you want, if it doesn't actually make whatever you expect happen, then you want to change it. And in effect, you may have a policy with procedures that are different for the types of programs. So, you may have an evacuation policy, for example, for an outpatient program, which is very different from an evacuation policy for a housing program. So, there's a whole different structure to those two. So you're going to have basically subheadings in your policy around evacuation. Or you may have a policy manual that's completely separate for the types of programs that you operate. So you have to decide how you want to do that. And then always be thinking about, do you have the resources? I mean, you could write a really beautiful procedure, but if you don't have the personnel to implement that, or if you don't have the structures to make that real, then it's not going to serve you very much. So think about this in a way where policies and procedures are very personal. They're very personal to the organization, and one size certainly does not fit all. You can't borrow a policy and procedure manual from another organization and use it. It'll probably not fit. And I think that the idea of fitting well is sort of hearkening back to what John said about your own culture and your own structure. So policy and procedure has to fit well to the organizational structure. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so an example of policy and procedure updates, this is kind of something that you all lived through and are still living through, is the COVID, how COVID has really challenged us in terms of, being very quick and saying, hey, our world has changed. The way we're going to deliver services has changed. How are we doing this? Do we have to put policies in place so that everybody knows? I remember at the beginning of COVID a year ago, how confusing things were. I mean, people were, adding to the trauma of COVID itself. There was trauma in terms of people really all this ambiguity, and ambiguity just breeds sort of anxiety, and it distracts people from the work they want to do, because the world had changed, but there was no policy and procedure that was consistent that people could rely on. So I think most of you living through that can understand how important it was to kind of settle into a consistent and a structured and a way of kind of living in this moment of this uncertain and anxiety producing moment that made us all feel safer. And empowerment here, again, hearkening back to John's word about empowerment, during that time of uncertainty, there was no empowerment. I mean, everybody felt kind of a victim to what was happening. But once you put policies and procedures in place that are relevant and that people can follow and that people could feel safe in, then they could be empowered to do their jobs and to make, again, sound decisions around their work. Next slide. So, so here we go into kind of, a quick sketch of doing a revision, and again, in accordance with some regular review schedule. So, you take stock of, okay, who's involved in this? Let's get representation from that team. If necessary, should we have the input of a general counsel or a subject matter expert around this particular issue, because it's new to us and there may be some liabilities that we want to have addressed. We then kind of using that to inform the development of the policy. We do the update, we get approval, and then the distribution. And this can take a number of forms. We could distribute it to a select group of people first and get feedback, or we could do a wholesale distribution, but have a period of time where people are able to respond before we kind of decide this is how we're going. And then where necessary, we provide training. In particular, if there have been such tremendous and extreme changes to the policy that we feel we need to retrain the staff in that particular policy and procedure. So let me hand it over now to Marlo, who's going to take us to the next few slides.
Thanks, Eve. So in line with an effort to update policies and procedures on an ongoing basis, one question comes to mind of how do we know if our policies and procedures are being implemented as planned? Are our thoughtfully crafted plans going as planned? Well, those questions definitely beg other questions, such as are our procedures easy to read, easy to understand, easy to follow? Are the necessary resources to enact policies and procedures readily accessible to everyone? Are all team members fully informed and have the skills to enact policies and procedures? How would we know? And going along with the narrative we've had for today, do people need additional training? And one other question perhaps could be, did we miss something new that our current policy doesn't cover? For instance, again, in the wake of the pandemic, with new tools, technologies, approaches being used to make our work truly work for us, given the circumstances, has there been a need to amend a policy even slightly to account for procedures that we've probably all been using, but haven't yet, connected to an established policy or to a new policy? So in this effort to measure implementation success, it's often very helpful to gather ongoing feedback from team members to determine how policy and procedures are matching up with the realities of the work environment. For instance, how is our new communications policy going, considering that we all just got trained on using a communication tool that's new and unfamiliar to all of us? Your organization might decide how long to monitor an implementation before reviewing to determine any patterns or issues that need troubleshooting. What are we willing to change when we see the data or the feedback? When people are saying what's good and not so good about the new policy, how would we navigate that with the team and negotiate with them how they would either adapt to the new policy or help to change it for the better? And with talk of all this, we just want to reiterate the importance of measuring implementation success by debriefing as often as possible to support safe, smooth, and consistent program operations. And this may involve reviewing policies and procedures, such as those we may be already familiar with around emergency evacuations, incident management, safety planning, Going over all of these frequently will help the team be as prepared as they can be, not just for the daily work, but also for unexpected occurrences. If we go to the next slide, we wanted to further reinforce the importance of feedback. So feedback, it is food for the organizational soul. We want to emphasize that policies and procedures don't work in a vacuum. They work when they match well with the realities people face in the actual work environment. And what better way to see how something works than to give the opportunity for people to practice and pilot it in their settings, get their feedback, monitor the impact for a period of time that you decide, collect the data and the outcomes, and use them as a compass for new directions and fine-tunings. So some questions for us to reflect on while we go along this process might include, does the policy align with our organization's mission, vision, and values? Are the objectives, the targeted outcomes, and the roles clearly defined? Are things easy to follow, or are things overly complicated and overwhelming for folks? So all that to say, as creatures of habit, when we make intentional efforts to be aware of what's happening, and we make this an exercise of awareness for our teams, we make positive and impactful changes based on how the test runs go and based on the feedback from those most affected by policies and procedures. In the next slide, we're going to dive deeper into how we might translate our measure of implementation success into the tangible realm of documentation. So alongside our efforts to measure implementation success, our work to maintain training records is helpful. It helps us stay up to date. It helps us stay organized. Again, it helps us to stay aware and ultimately responsive, especially in light of changes to things like regulation, as we continue to strive toward expectations set by funders and regulatory bodies, and most importantly, to support the workforce with the tools and skills needed to conduct their roles safely and competently. So in our record keeping, it's often helpful to organize or keep track of a lot of information and a lot of moving parts, and to guide the process by using a checklist or a user-friendly template. So one example is a checklist of individuals and their training track record, whether it's a training track record reflected in training certificates or attestation forms that acknowledge understanding and agreement to enact updated policies and procedures. One other example is a checklist of updated policies and procedures that are maybe pending for team training, really whatever works for your team to show your efforts and to measure progress. And in line with this systematic approach is the idea of using a template to conduct training, program by program, in an organized and planned fashion when multiple agency sites need updated training, especially in considering what to standardize and what to customize based on the unique needs and circumstances of each agency site. Finally, it's helpful to consider storing all of our organized and well-documented records in a central, readily accessible location to be referenced by all interested parties, and that can include compliance, HR, leadership, other stakeholders, our team members. Now I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, who will show us an example of the checklist.
But before you do that, Danielle, I just want to say one thing, that we're talking a lot about making sure policies and procedures are user friendly, and I think that's very important. I think we've basically hammered that in. But I also want to talk about morale a little bit in terms of policies and procedures how they're experienced by the workforce, and to ensure that people understand and that there is a rationale, and that people don't experience policies and procedures as being sort of arbitrary. There are some things that an organization has to do in order to be sort of compliant with their own with standards of practice, and then so there are things that are negotiable, and there are things that aren't negotiable. There are things that you just must do. So So I want people to sort of not forget that part while you're doing everything that we're saying, that you keep in mind that, policies and procedures affect human beings. And we want to make sure that the human beings in question aren't sort of disengaged from why you're doing this and why this policy and procedure is important. And even though it may seem to someone, gee, I wish we could go back to the old way, or gee, this is really like too much, but to understand why, even though they may experience it that way, that this is something that has to happen because the organization can't really, it's not negotiable for the organization not to have this in place. So what I'm talking about here is that there's a filter over all of this, which is the experience of your workforce. It's the workforce experience of all of this work that needs to be attended to in as much as everything else we're discussing.
Eve's,
I think that's the
I was going to say, Yves, that one of the things that really is a great example of that is where you do have a mandate from state or federal government that certain things have to be in place. It could easily come down to staff or other stakeholders as something that's going from top down. Then when you talk about the specific policy in a specific setting, there might be ways of achieving the end result desired by the funding source, a way to achieve it that's responsive to the concerns that are arising among staff or concerns arising in the community, some factor that might be of real concern to people. And then in that way, you wind up with a win-win situation where everybody feels like they're taking care of the things they have to take care of, and they're also making sure they're taking care of the staff concerns.
I think one way that we can do that is when we are updating policies and procedures. A few webinars ago, we talked about how to actually write policies and procedures. And one thing that we stressed was really talking about rationales and documenting rationales in the policy. Why is this policy in effect? What is the purpose of this policy? So I think when that happens and we update policy, we also need to update rationale so that we are sort of taking care of the workforce and helping them to understand, or whoever the stakeholder is involved in the policy, helping them to understand why this exists.
Yeah, and I think that stresses even more, gives more emphasis to the idea of the importance of gathering staff feedback. Your team is very important, and their thoughts are highly valued. Hopefully, we've reiterated that several times.
I think so.
And it's just one thing, and it speaks to something else. Marlo, as you were saying that, I was thinking, this whole idea of giving people voice, and how that kind of brings us back to this whole the piece that we did on recovery. So if we have a culture of recovery, I mean, this fits right in, right? Feedback, giving people a voice. It sort of all comes together. It's almost a full circle that we've done here. So yeah, that's great. I really like the way this has sort of made this circle.
Awesome. So I think the next slide is just sort of we realize that everybody does not have data management software that sort of helps them to remind them of when policies and procedures should be reviewed. So we just thought it might be nice to share something like this to show you that you can develop checklists, and you can use those checklists to sort of help track and monitor when policies are due for review and updating. And of course, this is not, an exhaustive list that could go on probably for 3 more slides about what could be included in this employee handbook. We wanted to give you another example. So we're going to move into another poll now. And this time, we want to know about how you disseminate information before we move into that part of our presentation. So take a couple minutes, or not a couple minutes, but about 45 seconds to answer this poll question. How does your organization disseminate updated or new policies and procedures? So via email, alongside staff training, whether that's in a meeting or in supervision, updated and posted through an agency intranet or shared drive. It's shared with supervisors who then choose how they're going to disseminate that information, or we don't disseminate updated policies and procedures. And I hope no one picks that one. So we'll take just a couple seconds to have that poll come up and be answered. And if there's something we missed, feel free to chat it in the chat box, because I could think of a couple off the top of my head, like it depends. Maybe it depends on what the policy is or what the procedure is.
Yeah, so a couple of people actually chatted in that some of these are a combination of how they disseminate policies and procedures. One individual responded they do both A and B. In terms of the poll response, 14% said they receive it, they disseminate it via email, 13% alongside staff trainings, 10% chose C, 5% chose D, and only one person responded, we don't disseminate.
Excellent. That's what we like to hear. Most people do not disseminate. Most people do disseminate information. And I think that, you know, what you guys are all saying is right. You know, it's probably a fair assumption to assume that depending on what the policy is or the procedure is, there'll be various number of ways that we share information with those folks involved. So let's go to the next slide and sort of shift into training. This is sort of like this visual representation that I like, because it sort of gives us the idea that policies and procedures should be dynamic, sort of living documents. And it really is this sort of cycle of explaining what happens, you know, whether that's in a training or updating and refining information, and then sort of starting that process again, because like Eve showed us with that arrow, and like Marla was saying earlier, you know, it really is a matter of talking with staff, developing, or talking with your team, developing policy and procedure, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, training, disseminating information, and then doing it all over again. So next slide, please. All right, so a little bit more about how training might happen. So procedures are obviously, we've talked about this earlier, right, or in earlier webinars. There's sort of the step-by-step instructions that everybody gets and should be able to follow, right? And these instructions are the ones that create systems for your organization, and those relate to organizational health and being able to evaluate programs. Even I often talk about, you know, the problem of procedure drift. If there are several procedures followed by different by different people, instead of following the procedure that's being given to people. And so we suggest that you use a manual, or, you know, develop a manual and use the actual written policy and procedure as a training guide. It might be helpful for you to be hands-on and really walk people through the procedure using that manual or written policy. And you want to think about how do we know that someone really understands this policy and procedure? So there's a couple things we can do. One is practice, which I think is on the next slide, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The other thing is, you know, consider using some sort of attestation or acknowledgement form, and you want to think about doing that for certain policies, just to make sure that you're now aware that that person has been given a policy and procedure, that they understand it, let them ask questions, and walk them through the process. Version control is also important, and we talked a little bit about version control earlier, especially when we were talking about those templates, right? So, you know, you want to have on your policies and procedures, you want to have the version that it is, if it's been updated, when it was last updated, and when it's due for updating. And that'll help you figure out, you know, what's the current policy. And then as far as updating and version control, you know, you also want to make sure that the changes are communicated, right? So if something happens in a program, let's say, and that's the reason that you're updating a policy, then that program director may say they're updating the policy, but then it needs to go up the ladder, right? It needs to go up and down so that everybody's sort of aware of the changes and the changes are being communicated. Whoever's responsible for that update really does need to communicate that change, not only to the staff, but also to the administrators. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that might happen on the next slide. So think about training supervisors or directors first. And we suggest that because these are the people that are going to be modeling the behavior, right? They're going to be, quote unquote, enforcing the policy, but they're also really there to support the staff who are going to be making decisions and following that procedure, right? Following that protocol. So they should be sort of the experts. We like to say subject matter experts sometimes. So those folks are going to be the subject matter experts, and they're going to have the knowledge and confidence to help other people understand the policy. They can address questions, they can address concerns during the training process, and they will, well, they'll be the person that's going to explain the rationale, right? They're going to explain the why. And when people explain the why and understand the why, chances are you won't have that procedure drift because everyone will sort of be on the same page. And I think back in our first webinar, or maybe it was our first or second webinar, we talked about policy and procedure as if it was like a playbook, right? And following playbook. So this is sort of the same thing. You want to make sure that people know their roles and understand what their roles are. So when the time comes, they're able to sort of get on stage and do that performance and perform really well and not be hesitant about what they're supposed to be doing. So how you communicate changes is also really important. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, and you talked about it in the chat box during the poll just now, but some minor changes, things that aren't, monumental, those probably can be communicated over email or through a memo or in a verbal announcement in a meeting of some sort. But when there are large, more complex changes, if there's changes related to strategic plans or things that really do affect large-scale change in policy and procedure, we want to do that in a different way. We want to do that through formal training, and we want to do that perhaps in a group setting where things can be explained and discussed and feedback can be received. So some examples of practice that we talked about in the previous slide, we talked about practice a little bit, and this will sort of help your staff or whoever the stakeholder is become confident in the policy and procedure. Practice things like, building evacuation, if there's a chemical spill, if there's safety trainings. These are the things that you want to practice hands-on, like in vivo with various stakeholders.
Yeah, Danielle, I just want to say something about technology here, because I think that that if you have the technology and if you can buy the technology to keep all of this, all these policies and procedures on an intranet, so that what happens is that there is a central way for whoever is doing the, once changes are discussed, that you don't keep paper manuals where there may be sort of outdated stuff. When you have a central sort of electronic place where you keep all this stuff, then when a change is made, it's made there. And therefore, at that point, everybody has access to that change. You can also do or program electronic platform that when a change is made, everybody's alerted. An alert is sent to everyone to check the policy for those changes. So I know that not everybody has that technology, but if you are thinking about sort of getting technology, get technology that can do this kind of thing, because it'll make your lives much easier, and there'll be no time wasted in going to programs, collecting old manuals and replacing them with new ones. It also saves a lot of trees, which I think is important.
That is true. And there's a lot of software out there. I mean, I've worked with organizations that have used various ones, and some of them are not very expensive. And it's anything from using, share drives to actual software. Basecamp, I know I worked with a program that used Basecamp once. We used it at NIAPRIS for a project that we're involved in. Microsoft Teams can be used for communication, I know. So there's definitely some stuff out there that's available. And it just helps because, it's another way. It's sort of like built-in reminders, and it's another thing you don't have to worry about remembering to do. So before we go into questions, feel free, by the way, to use the chat box and type in your questions, because we have a few minutes left for questions. But before we do that, I'm going to turn this back over to John, and he's going to sort of wrap things up for us with our key points for today.
So I'm hoping, I think we're all hoping that all of you are sort of thinking about policies and procedures a little bit differently. That it's a fluid process. It's one that requires sort of ongoing attention. So we want to be looking over, discussing, and relating to our organization's policies and then the procedures in the organization and updating them on a regular basis. If you think about what's gone on just in the last year and ask yourself the question, are there any policy implications in my organization? And do we have to develop some procedures in how we deal with things? So we had COVID. Clearly, there's all kinds of directives coming from multiple state governments and local government, et cetera, federal government, payroll-related things and physical plant-related things. There's so many issues that were going on. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What policies do we have to deal with to address institutional racism, and then how do we proceed with this? And just recently, we just had the passage of making adult use marijuana legal. What are the policy implications for our organizations and procedures? Again, these are new things, and if we're in a culture in our organizations where we're readily looking at them, we're including all stakeholders in the conversations, where it's a sort of a team approach, then we have a situation where the process, again, is not, people in 5 administrators in a boardroom or 3 administrators in a boardroom handing down these policies and procedures. There's been conversation about it. People are involved in the process. There's a sense of, I think, buy-in that happens when we handle it that way. And the importance of including subject matter experts. How many times during the course of this last year did we have the medical director from OASIS or the medical director from the City Department of Health or the New York State Department of Health or from OMH involved in conversations about how to implement various policies and procedures, in our programs? The idea, so whether it's medical or IT, there's been so many changes made, and to have relationships with subject matter experts and to use their guidance is really, critical. And then also just making sure, I think, and Yves mentioned this earlier, the idea that you have the mechanisms in place so that when you develop the policies and update them, there's something alerting you to the fact that it needs to be done. And then once you do it, making sure that it's accessible to everybody. Next slide, please. And so, again, key point of communication among staff, making sure that everybody knows, that the changes are occurring and understands, how to kind of move through what might be a new situation in a different way, or to either to address something that's been existing in a new way, or addressing a new situation in a new way, and just really to have that conversation and making sure that everybody understands, like, why are we doing this, and then making sure that it's documented and really has it gets incorporated into, again, staff conversations, staff training, and not just staff, but also the people who are serving and the community and boards of directors, that everybody's somehow involved so that everybody's, kind of on the same page, and making sure that communication is always there. And I think maybe just ending there, just to say, again, it's a process, and it's one that really, how we handle policy and development of policy, how we handle the development of procedures for how people are going to behave in our organizations, really speaks to the culture of our organizations. And we could use the process of revising policies and procedures, helping people to understand them, not just to obey them, but really understand them, embrace them, and be able to be, good advocates for these policies and procedures, is really, I think, a good goal that can help to transform the cultures in our organizations so that we are more sort of respectful of the value that everybody brings to the conversation. So there's really an opportunity to use this as a management tool in a very positive way.
Great point. Thank you so much, John. I know there's at least one question and one comment in the chat box. Just real quick, Tara, if you just move to the next slide really quickly, there is a slide we put in here about resources. So these are all the resources that we've put in the last few webinars. We just wanted to add them and include them here as well, just some various resources around like where you might find some templates or some ideas around policies specific to perhaps board, and some evaluation tools. So we're gonna, we just included that as well. So if you want to move back to the Q&A slide, I know Tara, you've been keeping track, and we have a few minutes left for questions. And I know there was a comment about revisions and where to perhaps keep or note revisions. There was someone who wrote it in the chat box that a best practice they found was to put the last date of revision on the actual document. That's the actual policy and procedure document. So that was, yes. Thank you for that comment.
And then we had a question about what happens if you have an employee who won't follow policies and procedures. Yes. I think that's another webinar about about managing recalcitrant staff. I think no, but no kidding. All kidding aside, you know, like everything else, I mean, yeah, I would want to do an inquiry as to is the person just contrary? Is the person not understanding, or is the person sort of doesn't feel competent in following the policy? I mean, I think you have to come back to what the reason is. And so you would handle it differently depending on what the reason is. But certainly if it's a blanket, you know, I'm not following policies and procedures, I think then maybe the person is a bad fit for the organization.
But it's interesting that you bring that up, Eve, because I think that if there is this idea of I'm not willing to sign this attestation or acknowledgement form, as the person doing the training, you may want to ask yourselves, like, you know, the question, maybe I need to reconsider training, right? Is there something we're missing in the training? Is there another piece perhaps that we're missing that we need to involve in the training so that people can understand policy and procedure?
Sure.
And that might or might not be an issue, but it's certainly something to think about.
Yeah, if there's some kind of an obstacle for that person, you know, or they have a process issue, like, you know, I'm not sure where this came from and I'm not willing to sign something unless I really understand it, might provide an opportunity for, you know, kind of revisiting the process within the organization. But you know, it is a difficult, that's a difficult management challenge.
I mean, look, I've had situations where somebody will, you know, you have a staff scheduling policy and procedure, and one of the things may be that every staff person has to work on the weekends. All right, and you may have somebody who says, I can't sign this, I can't agree to this because I can't work on the weekends, or I'm a Sabbath observer, or whatever it is that, you know, somebody finds that they can't possibly adhere to the policy. Well, then, you know, it becomes a question sometimes of accommodations. I mean, is the organization prepared to make some accommodations for people?
Right.
You know, I think it's a loaded. I thank you for the question, but it's a loaded question because you really can't answer it. You really have to have more information, and then you have to kind of put your best foot forward and try to come up, as John suggested earlier, to some win-win, you know, where the employee can then be able to follow the procedures and the organization can acknowledge the employee's need.
And it's probably a case that not every question not every question is a yes or a no. You know, not every question, you know, or not every policy is as clear cut. I think, as you just suggested, Eve, there's circumstances that arise, and that's why managers have to manage, and why, you know, the communication process is really, really important.
All right. So with that, it is 1 minute after 2. So I'm going to go ahead and say thank you to everyone who participated today, as well as for those of you who participated in all of our webinars in the series. Also want to give a great thank you to Tara, who's behind the scenes helping us always from McSilver and MCTAC, and want to, of course, thank all of our partners, John, Marlo, and Eve. And we hope to see you all soon at another MCTAC offering. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
So long, everybody. Be well.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Yes, you will. Thank you.